come on up.
Yeah. I'll get recorded.
Yeah, just feel free to ask questions or whatever as we go. This is going to be a short session, a half an hour, just talking about media insurance. Most of you were in the room before. I'm Jeff Hermes from the Media Law Resource Center. This is Steve Mandell from Mandell Menkes here in Chicago. So let's go ahead and get started. Standard disclaimer: we're lawyers, but not your lawyers, that kind of thing. So media insurance. What does it cover? I mean, what are we talking about here? Generally, when we're talking about media insurance, we're talking about media policies which are specific to organizations who are engaged in gathering of information and publication of information. I don't know if you...
I think the danger here is that people sometimes think they have other insurance coverage that protects them. So, for example, there's insurance called general liability insurance, and sometimes that has something called advertising injury coverage. And people think, well, I got general liability, so that's covering me for that. And in fact, that's not the case. Usually separate policies cover separate types of injuries. You might have a tech policy or a homeowner's policy. And really if you're a publisher publishing news content or entertainment content, you want to make sure you have something called errors and omissions, publisher's errors and omissions liability insurance.
Right. And you might have heard about the fact that some homeowners insurance policies have given people coverage when sued for libel for blogging or things like this. That does happen. It's becoming rarer and rarer as insurers are realizing that they're covering these lawsuits, and these policies do change over time. And also, it generally doesn't apply to work done in the course of your business. So, that wouldn't solve your problems if you're doing this in a professional capacity. So, okay, how do you find insurance? Finding a broker in this context is pretty much as important as identifying the carrier and where your insurance is coming from, because there are lots of different types of media policies, and you need somebody who knows media insurance in particular and can work through particular types of policies. Steve was kind enough to pull together some names. This is a great place to either remember to ask us for the slides later or take a picture of what's on the screen. So these are a couple of brokers from the Chicago area who are great for sort of newspaper and news gathering kinds of issues. Okay. And a group of folks who do video and film. Different kinds of policies come up when you're dealing with audiovisual works than when you're dealing with textual works. So you can have different kinds of issues. For example, if you need like copyright liability insurance, that might be something that comes up more in certain kinds of contexts than others. So okay, you find a broker. Great.
Let me just add to that. A broker who knows media insurance is really important, because not all media insurance is created equal, right? And you have to know, for example, some policy might cover or exclude something like restraint of trade, right? Well, but a lot of media claims involve claims for unfair competition. So you need somebody or some policies will say, we don't cover misappropriation of trade name or slogan, but you're going to be doing a lot of work with trademarks, so you want to make sure you have trademark coverage. Well, the language sounds a lot alike, but it's really different. And a broker who knows the media sphere will be able to guide you through what you want.
And these ones that you list that are both based in Chicago, do they operate nationally? Or are they mostly concerned with local organizations?
Mostly local organizations. I think
these folks, Marsh and Aon are two brokers who do a lot of media work, who, if you're looking for something more nationally oriented.
Right.
No, I just need somebody that can help us in California. I don't want somebody who's... Yeah.
Right. I think I got these names from a carrier who deals with brokers, and so they thought that if we're dealing with smaller companies, and they deal with Marsh or Aon,
exactly.
they might get lost in the
totally.
But if you want somebody in California, on the more boutique side, I can get that for you, I'm sure, or get some names for you.
That'd be fantastic.
Okay. So, finding a broker is great. They will find hopefully they will find a selection of policies for you. And so the question is, what do you do when you have these policies in front of you? A few pieces to this. First, not all policies are the same, as we're just talking about. They can have different kinds of coverages in them. So going automatically for the cheapest one isn't necessarily going to be your best bet. It is important when you are reviewing options for insurance to ask for a specimen policy. Brokers will often give you term sheets, sort of coverage summaries. Those are great, but they are not binding. So if there is, and sometimes there are differences between what's in the policy and what's in the term sheet. That's on you generally in terms of what your coverage is. You can't go back and say, I thought I was buying this other policy. So ask for the specimen policy. That's something which, if you're depending on the broker, you might or might not get automatically. It's also important as a consequence to know how to read an insurance policy. They are complex documents, they are complex contracts. They are, however, subject to sort of a more careful examination under the law than virtually any other form of contract that you can come upon. There are usually cases discussing the specific meaning of specific clauses which are routinely used in these contracts. And so they tend to be more standardized than in a lot of other contexts. 3 key sections of an insurance policy. The coverages, that's where that lists out who is covered and what they're covered for. The exclusions, those are carve-outs from the specified coverages. So coverages gives you, here's what you're covered for. The exclusions then take pieces of that out. And that can be in terms of specific acts which are not covered or specific conditions where the coverage doesn't apply. You can, we cover you for this, but not if you are doing X, or not if the act occurs in the course of Y, or not if you're thinking Z. And then there are exceptions. So coverage, exclusion takes stuff out, exceptions put stuff in. So it's basically that back and forth. You look at what the coverage is, you figure out what's carved out, and then you take a look at what's carved out from the exclusions and put back within the coverages. Virtually every insurance contract is structured in that way. So if you can just look at it and figure out those 3 pieces, you're a long way towards figuring out what the policy says.
There are some other important provisions, like, for example, who gets to select counsel? You get to choose your own lawyer, or does the insurance company get to choose the lawyer? Usually, if you want the right to choose your own lawyer, you're going to be paying, more of a premium. Are your fees part of your limit or outside your limit? That's another important provision. Then one that not a lot of people are sensitive to is, does the insurance policy have something called a hammer clause, right? And a hammer clause is where the insurance company, let's say you get a settlement demand of $100,000 on $1 million claim, and you say, you know what, I'm not paying 1 cent for this, it's a frivolous claim. Well, the insurance company can come to you under this hammer clause and say, okay, here's $100,000, you're on your own. It allows them basically to get out of coverage if you reject a settlement demand, if you want to reject a settlement demand within policy limits. So again, that's something that your broker will help you with, but it's also a lesson in that you got to read the policy or the various quotes that you've been given in the policy so that you can evaluate what you're being proposed, right? Because even though one may be cheaper than the other, you're not necessarily getting the same protection.
Now, selection of counsel, 2 points on that. This is one place where your carrier matters extensively, because carriers have rosters of counsel who handle these issues. And so if they have good media counsel on their lists, then having them select counsel, you're probably going to be in better shape. That's a tough one to determine in terms of, from the outside, if you don't happen to know what the media bar looks like. But if you have an opportunity to talk to the broker and say, hey, where are these guys getting their lawyers from? That's a good thing. Also, insurers can defend you if you are sued under what's known as a reservation of rights. That's basically where they're saying, we're not sure whether you're covered or not. We can't determine that until later because certain exclusions might apply depending on how the evidence in a case develops. And so,
Like a prime example is you get sued for defamation, and they say, okay, we cover defamation, but we don't cover intentional defamation, right? And so if it turns out that you did this intentionally, we reserve our rights to not pay for any judgment against you, right?
and to not pay for your attorney. So that,
Well, I mean, I would say that a reservation right, they're going to defend you. They say, we'll defend you under a reservation of rights, right? But once we find out that you've done this intentionally, then all bets are off. But the important thing is, once a carrier reserves rights, the law in most states is that creates a conflict between the carrier and any lawyer they may choose to represent you and yourself. And it gives you the right to choose a lawyer of your own choosing, provided that the lawyer's fees are sort of common or general in the locale.
so that's important because that gives you a lot of power in terms of selecting somebody who really knows what they're doing to defend you specifically rather than the insurer. So that's an important piece. Okay. So media coverage specifically, as you're reading the policy, some things to ask yourself. First, who's covered? Your company's going to be covered. Your employees are probably going to be covered. Whether freelancers are covered or not is actually a question for some policies. And if you work with freelancers a lot, the freelancers might want coverage in case they get sued. So whether or not you're going to spend money on coverage that extends that far is an interesting question, because that will be more expensive because you're dealing with coverage for somebody who is outside of your direct control, and so that factors into the underwriting, et cetera, et cetera. What is covered? Now, I mean, most media policies will cover sort of traditional publication torts, your libel and privacy issues. Some may cover some of your news gathering activities or, your costs if you were subpoenaed to give up a source or something along those lines. So, those are options. I mean, I'm not sure that every policy has those, but I think that those do exist.
I think carriers have tried to distinguish themselves from each other, and so they've offered like little benefits that doesn't cost them a lot of money, like subpoena coverage or access coverage. They'll support a media company's efforts to get access to court proceedings or something like that.
Copyright and trademark issues, intellectual property issues. There are entire separate policies dealing specifically with intellectual property claims and intellectual property use. You might find a media policy which has some intellectual property coverage, but again, it's a matter of reading what that coverage is, figuring out with your broker whether or not that's right for your particular activities and whether there's enough within these.
Right. I think most media policies recognize that if you're a newspaper or a broadcaster, you're going to be dealing with images, and so they're going to provide copyright infringement coverage. Trademark infringement, that gets a little more uneven. Patent infringement, no way. And then you also have to be concerned now with like data security and tech coverage. And I really think you need to work with the broker to see where the lines are drawn, because most of those policies, they provide you with third-party protection. In other words, someone else sues you because you allowed their data to be compromised. And then there's first-party coverage, the coverage that protects the entity that allowed the data breach when they have to give notice and to all their customers about the breach.
So if you're gathering a lot of subscriber data or consumer data, and you're running a risk if that gets disclosed, if that gets hacked or disclosed to third parties, that's the kind of place where cybersecurity insurance can be very, very useful. Again, usually that would be in a separate policy. Okay, and then the exclusions. Steve, you mentioned actual, situations for intentional defamation.
Right.
Sometimes it's keyed to actual malice, where if you were in the defamation discussion earlier, you would have heard about actual malice as a standard. But again, they can carve these up in lots of different ways so that your negligent acts are covered, but if you are found later to have acted with actual malice, you're not.
If an employee sues you, usually that's covered because there's a separate policy for that, right? Employment practices liability. Environmental, separate policy for that. Slip and fall in your lobby, separate policy for that.
Okay, applying for insurance. So this is important because applying for insurance can be difficult. You get asked a lot of questions about your publication activities, how long you've been publishing, what forms you publish in, how many people work for you, historical information, which can be difficult to track down. Nevertheless, it is really, really important that you answer those questions as fully and completely as you are able and are honest when you don't know the answers. Do not guess, because there are two things that can happen. The second is potentially more severe for the first. The first is that your coverage doesn't apply, and the insurance company says we're not going to cover you because you lied to us about what you're doing, and so we couldn't do our underwriting properly. That's the lesser result. The worst result is that it is a felony in most jurisdictions to make misstatements on an insurance application, because that's what we call insurance fraud. So unless you want to do time, you don't, or have severe criminal penalties against your organization, and fines and things like that, you want to avoid that. So when applying for insurance, you will get asked these questions. Talk to your broker about what they want. Do your internal investigation to try to figure out as much as you can. If you do not know, say you do not know. That might mean that you can't get coverage from a particular provider, or it might cause the rates to go up, but it's a lot better than having cheap coverage, which one doesn't cover you, and two gets you sued or prosecuted.
When you submit a claim to an insurance company, one of the first things they do is they go to the application, right? Because they want to see, were they truthful in the application? They also want to know, well, when did this claim first arise, and what's the date of the application? In other words, is it possible that you as the applicant knew about this claim or suspected it was in the works before, and that's why you applied, or that's why you sought to increase your limit? So it's real important to be truthful and consult with an expert or your broker about what you're putting in the application.
This is a trap that often comes up at the time of renewal. Often, your insurer will send you a form which says, okay, we have your data from the last time, what are you doing now? Be really careful about just writing, oh, doing the same old thing, because chances are you're not in some fashion. So go take a look at what you wrote before, think about how things might have changed since your initial application, and make sure you're keeping them up to date appropriately. Now, that doesn't mean you need to go tell them necessarily, if you've been fully honest on the application at the time you submit it and things change during the term of coverage, you're not necessarily on the hook to inform them about every time you hire or fire somebody, or every time you have a personnel change, or every time you decide to launch a new product. But the next time your insurance is up and they ask you the questions, you have to be truthful about it.
So what's the good news about insurance? I think that insurance carriers in this space are actually different than most insurance carriers that we deal with in other realms. And that's because it's such a small space, if any of them play fast and loose, or they don't support the First Amendment, they're not going to be in that space very long. So most of the carriers they do support the First Amendment. They realize that some claims you just have to fight them no matter what the cost is. Most of them have lawyers as claims handlers who actually work, as partners with outside counsel and their insured. So, in my experience, it's a pretty good group to work with, and not always looking for a way to save money or cut corners.
I mean, my organization, the Media Law Resource Center, is a trade organization for media attorneys. We also have many insurance companies in our membership who focus on media insurance. And our participants from the insurance side are very interested in maintaining good relationships with the lawyers who fight these cases on a day-to-day basis. They're invested in staying up on the boundaries of First Amendment law and media law, and in my dealings with them have been as invested in fighting for those rights and expanding those rights as the attorneys they work with. So that is somewhat unique. That is all we have in terms of this sort of basic presentation, but we do have a few minutes, so if there are specific questions, we're happy to talk about it. This is a shorter session than some of the others we've done.
I've got a question, maybe not, I don't know who it would be for, but do you guys know anything about, does Line do any sort of group insuring, or does the independent network of nonprofit news, does anybody know anything about that as far as group bundling?
I know INN has been talking about it. I don't know that they've succeeded with something. The Democracy Fund, which is a charitable foundation, has been working on a project to create lower cost insurance products. But I know that's in the works. I don't know how far they've gotten with it. So that's something.
Society of Professional Journalists, you can get insurance through them.
I know. Okay, I know SPJ had a legal fund where they.
No, this was actual insurance.
Okay.
I looked at it because I'm a freelancer.
Yeah. Okay. Authors Guild might also have a similar. Might also have rates if you qualify under their rules.
One thing I just mentioned, I mean, maybe you mentioned at the beginning, I don't know, but really the biggest disparity in terms of coverages, and maybe this is less true today than it used to be, but some coverages include all your legal expenses, or at least 80% of all your legal expenses, and others just cover liability. So that's a calculation you have to make, whether you want to pay more but get your legal fees essentially taken care of, or whether you're just in it to cover liability, but then you're going to be paying, if something happens, you know, X $100 an hour for your lawyer.
So this is why I have my executive director in the room in case there are gaps in the information. But yeah, that's an important point. I don't know. Most of the policies I've seen lately have coverage for have defense coverage built into it. So I and
The
maybe
big issue is whether that erodes the limits or not.
Right.
Which, you know, in today's day and age, with especially with electronic discovery and how expensive that is, I've got a case right now where the carrier is saying, "Hey, given your budget to get this thing through trial, I'm not sure that your insured has, you know, enough limits to cover it."
Yeah.
So, something to be.
Should we, if we have outside directors and they're obviously interested in D&O insurance, should that have a media flavor to it, or is that something totally separate?
I think, in my experience, that's something totally separate.
Okay.
But usually you can bundle these coverages at a lower cost than if you were going to, especially if you're a media company, and you just say, hey, we want coverage for our officers and directors. That would be cheaper than if you were.
Okay.
But I mean, as a practical matter, if the director gets sued for an article that you did, 99.9% of the time he has no idea about it or nothing role in it, you're going to get him dismissed right at the outset on day one anyhow.
and probably be the same attorney who's representing the organization, because there wouldn't really be a conflict
Not a
there.
big deal, yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to jump into your question. I represent the Alternative News Media Association. We worked for about a year to try to get some kind of group coverage. And one of the problems that we have is that we were working with Lloyd's of London, and they basically said that there's too much of a disparity in the sizes and coverage of the publications to be able to come up with a group pricing. And I think in a lot of different groups in my line, it could be one of them where it's just too hard for them to come up with some sort of uniform standard pricing. So that's what we've run into. I've been trying to come up with something for our members, and it's a lot more difficult than it sounds to come up with something.
Yeah, it would have to be a tiered structure for that reason, and the question then becomes how you define the tiers.
Right, exactly.
Because remember, the underwriting isn't just about the size of the organization; it's also about the scope of the publication and
And the history.
and the history.
So they really care if you've been sued many times. They're going to give you a different rate.
Sure.
Yeah, so just because you're a small organization doesn't mean your risk is going to be small. You can trigger a $7 million. You can trigger a seven-figure libel judgment just as easily, as a two-person operation.
The problem that came up at the last conference we were at, George, at the Tribune, was that freelancers are being asked to indemnify the publications that they are submitting to, yet they can't get insurance. And I made some calls at the time to Michelle Tilton, and I think there are some brokers that try and help people in that realm, but it's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, I've turned down work because of that. Those clauses in those contracts are outrageous. I freelance for the New York Times. They don't ask me to do that, but the ridiculous Pew Charitable Trust, which has $100 million in assets, wants me to indemnify them. It's outrageous.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say about those clauses, and we get a fair number of questions about those as well. I've talked to the Columbia Journalism Review about their study on these points. Is that those organizations don't really expect you to be able to cover, a major libel judgment. I mean, how could you? Yeah.
course.
Yeah, and and a lot of the time the excuse is, well, we just want to make sure that they're standing behind their work. That doesn't make it more palatable, depending, given the risk. And it's the kind of thing where I'd be a lot happier with that kind of indemnification clause if their insurance covered me, so that if there were a judgment against me, eventually it would all come from the insurer.
Well, you know what, no reporter publishes anything without being added. So if they're on the hook, they should be on the hook. I mean, I just.
Well, they can be sued directly anyway by the.
They have a lot more to get.
What I would, in that situation, what I would push back on is, and I don't know if you would do this, but the only consideration of doing it is to agree to indemnify them if you're found guilty of intentional
I
wrong.
mean, I'm looking at this and thinking I'm gonna lose my house,
Yeah,
you know,
no,
I
right,
can't,
no, and you
for,
should.
$1,000 freelance fees.
All I'm saying is that if they have to find that you intentionally did something wrong,
Yeah,
then
I
there might
actually,
be a
in
risk
case
that's
of
worth
Q, I
you
asked
take.
them to rewrite the
But
clause.
that's the only way, otherwise.
Really, some of them will take it out.
They wouldn't do it.
Interesting.
Of course, the irony is that if you and them get sued, they're gonna want
Of
you to
course.
help them,
Yeah.
right? So they're gonna need you.
Yeah, okay, it's really awful.
I mean, if you,
This is part of the contract that you have as a freelancer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't do the work, I just said to them, I can't do this if you don't, adjust this law.
Yeah.
Other people do it, I mean, there's a risk, but, I'm sorry,
I've done it a lot.
yeah, I mean, there's a risk,
But Jeff is right, the reason the Times can do it is that their insurance covers freelancers,
Yeah,
so it's not a huge,
Yeah.
it's still a nice step to comedy, but that's the practical
Yeah.
reason it's going on.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did, and I came in late. There's too much good stuff going on at the conference. So if this people heard this, just skip me. But I'm a brand new startup, and wondering if there's like just a resource place where I can go to get some ideas. Even before launch, I talked to a couple people. Some didn't even. I like a couple I went to some local insurance brokers in town, and most of them had no idea. They were just blank stares. Some of them said they would send some emails to get back to me, and then
these are names of brokers locally, and
the other thing was
you can contact Steve, and he will. If I don't know if you're in Chicago, but if you're not in Chicago, he might be able to help you.
actually a lot that were looking for like what I felt like I was putting the cart ahead of the horse because I was trying to get quotes and stuff even before launch to know what might this cost me, and they kept saying, "Where's your site? Where's your site?" I said, "Well, it doesn't exist yet, and it's about to. Now it does, just recently, but I felt like lots of the questions they were asking in these policy applications were not applicable at all to a very small local news organization. So I was kind of looking in the wrong place, basically.
The best I can tell you on that one is that if the application has a lot of things that don't apply to you, you need to be really clear that they don't apply to you as you're responding to the application, and talk to your broker because there might be options which are better suited to you. It could be that you're dealing with a broker who doesn't really know the field of media insurance in particular, and as a result, is giving you policies which are more suited to the New York Times than to your scale.
Yes, I think that was my problem.
Yeah, and so that's a problem with that's actually a problem with your broker rather than the application because they're giving you the wrong policies.
Now these are places where
These are local brokers in Chicago who have experience dealing with local newspapers in particular, and so might be better suited
can they
to
write
it.
policies in other states.
Well, these are going to be broker. If you need a broker in another state, that's a question you should direct to Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I just deal with a lot of carriers who then in turn deal with brokers. And I think their advice would be, well, if you're a smaller organization, you don't want to be dealing with the Marsh McLennan and the Aons of the world because they're used to dealing with the New York Times. And
So then who do you deal with locally? I mean,
Well, if
that's
you're-
my biggest hurdle is I don't even know who to call.
well, if you're in Chicago, then call.
Most
Where are you?
yeah.
Michigan.
Okay, so if you give me your card, I'll make an inquiry for you. And it very well may be that these people go outside of the Chicago area, like maybe they cover the Midwest.
And I'm really sorry, but
Yeah.
we're at 5 o'clock and we've got a plane we need to catch.